Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into the week 4 edition of my top starts and sits. I'm gonna go ahead and dive into today's video. I think you guys should know the drill by now. I'm gonna start at the quarterback position, giving you guys my top start. Two starts and my top two sits. Starting with my start of the week, I am going to go with Jordan Love against the Cowboys. The Cowboys have allowed the most fantasy points per game against quarterbacks this season. Just alone in their last two games, when they faced Russell Wilson and Caleb Williams, they've given up 748 passing yards and seven touchdowns in those two games. Just that alone makes me believe that Matt LaFleur and Jordan Love will get this passing attack back on track after having that rough game against a very good Browns defense this past Sunday. So I do love, no pun intended, I do love having Love in my lineups this week. My other start, he was my quarterback out of the week because I thought he was a very good streaming option for anybody that's looking to stream a quarterback this week. But I like Geno Smith against the Bears. The Bears have allowed the third most fantasy points per game against quarterbacks this year. So far in the first three games, two quarterbacks have finished with at least 250 passing yards. And then the Bears have given up 8 passing touchdowns in those three games, which is the most allowed in the NFL. Moving into my top sits of the week, I am going to suggest sitting the young quarterback that I do like in New England, Drake May against the Panthers. Surprisingly, the Panthers have actually allowed the fewest points per game against quarterbacks this season. Only one quarterback has finished over 200 passing yards in the first three games against Carolina, and they've only given up 2 passing touchdowns as well. So those are my reasons why I would suggest looking for a different option than May this weekend. My other top sit, I'm going to suggest sitting Dak Prescott against the Packers. The Packers have allowed the second fewest points per game against quarterbacks this season. Outside of stats, I'm sure you guys should know by now, CeeDee Lamb is not going to be playing in this game, so he's going to be missing his top wide receiver. Another factor in, Tyler Booker, their I believe he was the first round pick who was starting guard for them. He's not going to be playing, so he doesn't have that protection in front of him, which means that he might have to get the ball out of his hands, which could limit the potential explosive plays down the field. And then you just got to factor in that this is going to be a Micah Parsons revenge game, so I expect Micah to be putting pressure on Prescott quite often in this game. And then some other stats why I don't like Dak this weekend. When you look at their first three games, only one quarterback against the Packers have finished over 215 passing yards, and they've only given up 3 passing touchdowns as well. Moving into my top starts and sits at the running back spot. My top start of the week, I am going to go with Denver's lead running back and J.K. Dobbins against the Bengals. The Bengals have allowed the second most fantasy points per game against running backs this season. They've allowed, even though they've only played 3 games, they've allowed 4 different running backs to finish with at least 70 total yards in those in the first 3 weeks, and then they have also given up 5 running back touchdowns. So I like the chances of Dobbins going over 70 plus total yards and getting in the end zone at least one on actually on Monday night. That's a doubleheader on Monday night when they played the Bengals. My other top start I do like Breece Hall against the Dolphins this weekend. The Dolphins have allowed the 5th most points per game against running backs this season. 3 different running backs against Miami have finished with at least 95 total yards. So I'm expecting a big game out of a Hall. I know he's kind of coming off that rough outing against the Bucks this past weekend, but I'm looking for Hall to. I think he can go over I think he can eclipse the 100 total yard mark and get in the end zone at least once on Sunday. Moving into my top sits, even though he's coming off that great game against that Ravens defense on Monday night, I am going to suggest sitting David Montgomery against the Browns. As bad as the Browns offense may be this season and that team as a whole, the Browns do have a very good defense, as we saw what they did against the Packers offense this past weekend. And then you look at what they've done against running backs this year, they have allowed the second fewest allowed points per game against running backs this season. No running back has finished over 45 rushing yards against the Cleveland Browns in 3 games, which is something you need to factor in with David Montgomery, because Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get all the receiving work. David Montgomery's more of their groundwork guy. So the fact that the Browns have held every running back they faced so far underneath 45 rushing yards makes me not like him this week. I believe it was on the Move the Sticks podcast I heard this morning, if I'm remembering this correctly. The longest rush that the Browns have given up was an 11-yard rush, which was to Lamar Jackson in week 2. And then the other factor that you want to get in with Montgomery is like, hey, maybe he might not give me the yardage, but he might give me a couple touchdowns. The Browns have only given up 1 running back touchdown in the first 3 games. My other top sit, I know he's a fantasy darling right now. I'm a huge Cam Skattebo fan. When he was entering the draft class out of Arizona State, but I wouldn't chase the points that he had this past weekend. I'm going to suggest sitting Skattebo against the Chargers. The Chargers have allowed the 3rd fewest points per game against running backs this season. Now I was wrong last week with suggesting sitting Dobbins against the Chargers. Dobbins is the only running back that has finished over 45 rushing yards against the Chargers in the first 3 games. I should have factored in that revenge game factor. And then they've only given up 1 running back touchdown in 3 games. I'm very interested to see how the Chargers defense does approach the Jackson Dart-led New York Giants offense. I am curious, and this is why I maybe don't like Skattebo this week too, is do they load the box and try to take away the rushing attack of the Giants and force Jackson Dart in his first game to beat them with his arm? And then another factor in too, the Giants team is not that great. So what if the Chargers have been very good in the first 3 weeks? What if the Chargers go up 14 plus points at some point in this game? That's going to take the game script away from Skattebo, where he's not going to be getting you those touches which you would want out of him when he's getting his first time as the full. Assuming that Daboll doesn't start Singletary, assuming that he's going to make his first official start as the Giants back this weekend. Moving into the wide receiver spot, my top start of the week, I do like the rookie for Carolina, Ted McMillan, against the Patriots. The Patriots are tied for the 4th most allowed points per game against wide receivers this season. 2 different top wide receivers in the first 2 games finished with at least 95 receiving yards against the Patriots. They've also given up 4 wide receiver touchdowns. I really like what I've seen out of McMillan, especially when he jumped up and got that ball against the Falcons this past weekend. I'm liking what I'm seeing with him. He's a top option. I don't think Legette's going to be playing again this weekend, so he should be peppered with a lot of targets, and I expect him to have a high productive day against New England. My other top start, even though that Texans offense has been struggling, I think Nico Collins could finally give you a ceiling game this weekend against the Titans. Titans have allowed the 5th most allowed points per game against wide receivers this year. Himself, Nico Collins, he has finished with at least 80 receiving yards in 2 of his last 3 games against the Titans. He has scored a touchdown in 2 straight games against Tennessee as well. And then you look at the first 3 games for that Titans defense, 3 different wide receivers have finished with at least 70 receiving yards, and they've given up 3 wide receiver touchdowns. So I'm looking for him to get anywhere between 80 to 100 plus yards and getting at least in the end zone once against Tennessee this weekend. My other top sit, I know he might get peppered all those targets, but the Steelers passing attack has not been that pretty this season, and so that's why I'm going to be suggesting DK Metcalf sitting him against the Vikings. Not only has this Steelers offense been very inconsistent in the first 3 weeks, he does have a tough matchup. He's going against the Vikings, who have allowed the fewest points per game against wide receivers this year. In the first 3 games, not one wide receiver has finished over 70 receiving yards against Minnesota, and they've only given up 1 wide receiver touchdown. So if you do have to play him, maybe because of injuries or you just don't have other depth options, I understand it. I would just temper my expectations with Metcalf. But if you do have a different option you can turn to in the wide receiver room, I would consider doing that over DK. this weekend. My other sit, I didn't really like Drake May, so I'm not going to love his wide receivers. So I am going to be suggesting to sit Kayshon Boutte and Stephon Diggs against the Panthers this weekend. Panthers have allowed only the third fewest points per game against wide receivers this year. No wide receiver against Carolina has finished over 55 receiving yards against the Panthers in their first 3 games. And just like the Vikings, they've only allowed 1 wide receiver touchdown. So I think what it is a lot of teams are leaning on the ground game attack against Carolina, and that's why you're not seeing a bunch of production from the quarterback and wide receivers when they play the Panthers so far this season. Moving in to the final section, my top starts and sits at the tight end spot. Yes, he has definitely lost a step, probably multiple steps at this point, but I do like Travis Kelce as a good play against the Ravens this weekend. They've only allowed the 8th most points per game against tight ends this year, but even though and I think you got to factor in receptions and touchdowns and all that, but why they're at the 8th spot, but because the reason why I like him though is the Ravens have actually given up 218 receiving yards to tight ends through the first 3 games, which is the 2nd most allowed in the NFL. Another guy I do like Kyle Pitts against the Commanders this weekend. Commanders, it's kind of like a similar story. They're down in the bottom half of the top 10 of points per game allowed. I mean, top half of the points per game. They're giving up the 6th most points per game against tight ends this year, but they've been giving up a lot of yards. They've been giving up 213 receiving yards to tight ends this season, which is the 5th most allowed in the NFL. Moving into my top sits, a guy I've been loving in the first 3 weeks. If you guys have been following along with me, he was a top start for me last week, just because of all the targets that you get from him. So I do understand if you want to play Juwan Johnson against the Bills, he should be getting the targets, but I would temper your expectations if you play Johnson this week. He's going against a Bills defense that have allowed the 3rd fewest points per game against tight ends this year, and then they've only allowed tight ends to get 32 receiving yards so far this season, which is the fewest in the NFL. So you might be wondering, how do they give up the fewest tight end yards, but they're the 3rd fewest points per game allowed? That's because you got to factor in receptions, and I think they gave up a touchdown or 2 to the position. My other sit, I am going to go with Zach Ertz against the Falcons. It's kind of up in the air if Jaden Daniels is going to be playing or not. Obviously, you like Ertz a lot more if Jaden Daniels plays this weekend against the Falcons. But if he doesn't play, that makes me like Ertz a lot less more. And so that's a big factor in why I don't like Ertz, is just the up in air status about Jaden Daniels. But then when you look at the matchup, the Falcons have actually allowed the fewest points per game against tight ends this year. They've only given up 48 receiving yards to tight ends through 3 games, which is the 2nd fewest in the NFL. So yeah, those are my top starts and sits for week 4 of this NFL season. As always, guys, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I always want to see that number go up, but you can also follow me on all my social media platforms, mainly on X. That's where I'm the most active, as I always say, most likely to reply to things, but I'm also on TikTok and Instagram as well. I'll see you guys next Tuesday for my waiver wire targets and streamable defenses. Wish you best of luck. Talk to you soon. Peace out.